Anna, thank you so much for joining us and
thank
sharing
you.
your message of hope.
Thank you.
God will do a new thing. To what I heard is you suggesting hope in the present as much as in the future. Is that part of what you were going for?
I think that is it. And the thing that just always strikes me about that passage is it's not always what we're hoping for.
Mm-hmm.
The content of the hope is that we will find a way in the wilderness. Not necessarily the way we've asked for, but a way. And I find that really striking.
That's so important to discern that difference. And you talk about the present and the future, but I want you to look back for a moment with us, Anna. How did those words from Isaiah, how were they first revealed to you personally in your journey?
I don't know that I can pinpoint a time. I just know that every single time I have thought I knew the way, it has become clear that God had a different plan. We laugh at the seminary because I tell the students over and over that you cannot say never. I will never do this. I will never do, because it always happens. And the thing that has made those words deep for me is that the way God makes is never the way I would have chosen.
Oh, I can certainly relate to that. I know the plan that I think is going to happen usually doesn't.
Yeah.
It's always on God's time rather than my time. But the other thing I like that you seem to intimate is that God is constantly creating new hope for us each day. I think we tend to go and ask for hope when we need it the most, but it's an ongoing process, isn't it?
Yeah. Water in the desert, enough to feed you, enough to quench your thirst. What you need, not cake in the desert, not all, just something so simple as that.
How do you think, though, the promise in Isaiah speaks to families whose child has died, or to someone who's lost a spouse or a loved one? How do those words speak to someone who is at the bottom, where they really believe that their worst possible reality has come to be?
I remember when my father died very suddenly. I didn't want to hear those words spoken to me, but I took great comfort and hope, I suppose, in knowing that I was part of the thick memory. Remembering that the story of God is a story of people who are fed and people who are brought through. And if I'm part of that story, then somehow that will be made plain. Maybe not today, maybe not the way that I wish, but that is the promise. And that for me at that time was profound. It didn't always come from the words of others, but it came in knowing, in my bones, I guess, that God is faithful. In the end, God is faithful.
And so the hope that is still there when your worst fears are realized.
Yes. And it didn't make it better. I mean, it didn't make it easier. It just, it made it bearable.
Yeah.
I guess, yeah.
I was going to say, I think that nicely points out when we reach out to God in a time of need for hope. But you also talked about being open on a daily basis to more spontaneous hope.
Yeah.
How can we do that better in our lives, in our families and faith communities? Because it's always there for us, isn't it?
We are constantly doing this at the seminary because I think the thing that makes a good preacher is someone who pays attention. And so I'm constantly asking my students just to go out and look. And it's really just a matter, I think, of simply disciplining yourself and reminding yourself, maybe just for 5 minutes at first, but then longer as time goes, just look at what's going on around you. And if you look through the lens, perhaps of those words from Isaiah, things you wouldn't notice just begin to, it's a habit like anything else,
Awareness.
Awareness
and receptivity.
Yeah, right. And you have to start small and remind yourself, okay, I'm paying attention now for 5 minutes. I'm going to but then it becomes a habit, and you just do, and you see it.
Now, you know, I suspect that you also, along with your mother, have the mind of a poet in your teaching and preaching. Don't you teach a course in
Well,
preaching and poetry?
I have. My mother is a poet, and I use a lot of poetry in teaching because poets are people who speak the promises of faith.
And who notice.
And who pay
It's
attention.
that awareness.
The poet Mary Oliver says, I don't know what prayer is, but I do know how to pay attention. And we use that a lot with the students. I don't know what prayer is, but I do know how to pay attention. And that attending is a prayerful way of living. And then eventually, for students that I teach, it moves into sermons.
What are some of the ways that you weave the poetry into the sermons?
What's your inspiration?
Well, I don't know that I would, I mean, I used to, when I was younger, quote poetry, you know, just kind of quote those beautiful. Now what I try to do is I try to live the way poets do. I try to pay attention as closely and carefully as they do, and I try to trust that the words that I use are going to do their own thing. You know, not to control it so much the way I did when I was younger. So it's more of a way of trying to pay attention to a poetic process, I guess.
You must plug your new book,
Yes.
Preaching and as Testimony. What is it?
Yes, well, it's, it's about preaching. I really don't know what to say more than that.
It's a broad subject,
It's
right?
it's you know, my take on it at the moment. It's a book that I wanted my sister, my brother, my mother, my students, anyone I knew to be able to pick up and get through. I didn't want it to be a technical thing. I wanted it to be a book that said some true things about what I think preaching is, and also tried to help pastors and people in congregations try to remember some of what preaching is when we strip away the fear.
So how do you do that?
Well, the word testimony, as I'm using it, is not, you know, and now I'm going to tell you my story. I'm not really, but here I'm going to tell you what I saw, and I'm going to tell you what I believe about it. I'm going to tell you what I see in this text, and I'm going to tell you what I believe about it. And I can't offer you any more than that.
Give us an example.
Well, in this sermon that I just did today, what I was trying to do was to say, this is one thing I see in Isaiah. It's not the only thing to see. It's one thing I see. And I believe it so much I'm going to put my life behind it. And that's the only proof I can offer you.
And how do you hook kids into this? You have two young boys.
Oh, my boys are wonderful sermon listeners. Well, kids have an innate sense of when something's authentic and when it's not. You know, they have great BS detectors for, you know, to put it
They're your best test audience.
They
right?
They are. I mean, they know immediately when a preacher is faking it, or when a preacher is so afraid they're not saying what they really believe, or what they believe they see in the text. And so I think this is the kind of preaching we do when we're young. And I think it's the kind of preaching we all want to do when we're not afraid. You know, when we're not worried about what people will think about us or whether they'll fire me. It's not unleashing on everybody. It's just saying, this is one thing I see in the text, and I can't prove it to you by any other way than how I'm going to live.
You are also married to a preacher.
I am. Who's a teacher now, but I am, and he's my best critic, my best touchstone.